Okay, let's finish up chapter 22. We're going to talk about Mannerism, Southern Italian Mannerism, in fact. And this is actually going to influence a lot of the Northern high Renaissance painters as well as the latter Manneristic painters in Northern Renaissance, anything north of Italy in particular. So, some key elements to what makes it Mannerism versus your standard Renaissance elements that we've been discussing is that it's very unique in that it doesn't have a unified style. It's a very diverse, almost a personal stylistic decision with the artist in particular, and it doesn't really follow any of the Renaissance norms at all. And we're going to look at a painting in particular, figure 22.41, and we're going to look at a sculpture in particular. But we'll start at figure 22.41. And the mannerisms came about after Leonardo and Raphael departed. Okay, and it started a little bit with Titian, which we talked about as the colorist, and he had a very specific name because he incorporated some almost Gothic-like styles to his mannerisms. So he was called Greca, Maniera Greca, Maniera, next word Greca, and that's a Latin terminology essentially saying that his style of mannerism was very Gothic like. And the Mannerist painters were almost as recognized in a poor sense as that of the Gothic artist. It's not until much later that the Gothic artists during the late medieval period and these Mannerist artists during the late Renaissance period received any acclaim. In their time, in the heyday of Renaissance and the heyday of medieval art, the Gothic artists and the Manneristic painters and sculptors were not highly acclaimed. It really is not going to be until El Greco's stylization of Mannerism, coupled with his Byzantine interest in the Spanish courts in Toledo in particular, that Mannerism is really going to start to be more embraced, and that's not until later with the Northern Renaissance in Spain in particular. But during this time, the Mannerists really weren't. They were respected, but they weren't like sought after because they really personalized their styles. They weren't relying on mathematical or arithmetic formulas to explain the different humanistic features of the figures involved. There's not really much spatial dominance and presence with one ground versus another, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. It's almost on the verge of surrealism in some cases, which we'll see here in just a second. Now, everything that I've discussed is unified in both painting and in sculpture. So there's not going to really be a big difference between what mannerism looks like in painting and what mannerism looks like in sculpting. So let me just break down what we're really going to see and what you need to focus on in regards to the painting I'm going to show you and the sculpture I'm going to show you. First of all, they use a word called artifice, Artiface, which is synonymous to artificial. So that means the features that you see are artificial to nature. They're not typical to any kind of either mathematical formula or actual naturalistic. So when we've talked about the Renaissance up to this point, there's an emphasis on the Greco-Roman antiquity being reborn, also the rationalism of observation in nature, which is the naturalism, and then the empirical observations of that, like with studies of optics and all these new sciences, as well as the use of formulae to give a mathematical arithmetic equation of proportion to the human being. It's the Veruvian arithmetic formula. All right, and that's what's being used. Leonardo has used it, Raphael has used it, Michelangelo has tapped on it, but he's more interested in more of the beautified element of the tragedy in the work, or the tragic element of the way that the figures are convoluted and twisted, which is like on the verge, on the cusp of Mannerism and Renaissance with Michelangelo. Okay, but what we're going to look at today is going to be very much Manneristic, and everything we've talked about, except for Michelangelo, has been very Renaissance-esque. So they're less likely to distinguish contrived nature in art production. Now, what that means is a lot of the paintings and the images that we've been looking at have been contrived in a way to fit those type of rational, ideal elements of proportion and scale that we're trying to see in nature with our own eyes, like through optics. That's what Leonardo and Raphael and everyone we've been talking about has been trying to do. But with the Mannerists, they're not trying to try to fit it into this mold or into this box of what it really truly looks like in nature. Instead, they're exposing more of an emotional sense of style to the work. And so because of that, it will look imbalanced and unusual and imbalanced. And for example, there's going to be non-conventionality. So a lot of the conventions that I just talked about are going to start to go out the window. The element of mathematical placement and proportion, elements of scale and proportion are going to be offset. Elongations and distortions are going to be present. And very unusual traditional themes are going to be placed. Okay, so themes that we might have known in the past, but they're going to be more unusual. So what are our main adjectives we have there? Not contrived, imbalanced, so visually imbalanced. So that means that the spatial scale of depth will feel slightly imbalanced. Unusual and non-conventional, elongated and distorted. Okay, so almost abstracted, if you will. So let's look at the painting. Figure 22.41, Parmigianino Madonna with the long neck. And you should see right away the elongations. You should see the features of the neck being elongated. You should see the appendages of the baby Jesus elongated. The overall bodily disposition of the Madonna, which again is Mary, the mother of Jesus, is very elongated and very unusual. Okay, and to depict Jesus in this way is an unusual tradition. Okay, so the Orthodox Christianity theme that's here is not unconventional, but the way in which they're presented with these elongated like features and these exaggerations and distortions, they are unconventional. They are untraditional, unusually traditional is really the best way to explain the unconventionality. Is that they are traditional, but they're unusually traditional. Okay. One thing that he is using is a very dynamic contrapposto. Again, that's Contrapposto, contrapposto. So he's creating, and that's in the Madonna figure in particular. And even slightly, there's a little bit of a curve in the body of Jesus upon her lap. So he's bringing that Greek Roman element, but it's super exaggerated. Super exaggerated. Even while she's seated, it's exaggerated. Okay, so it's slightly distorted, and even that contrapposto, that S curve throughout their bodies, and her body in particular, is it's elongated. It's like a stretched S versus that of a tight S that we would see in some of the pieces prior to this. There is, again, non-conventional placement of space. The foreground, if you will, with Madonna with a long neck and with Jesus upon her lap, is encompassing the almost the whole entire composition. All right. So it's hard to see where the middle ground is and where the background is. And the figure to the bottom right in particular yields to this spatial unconventionality, where he looks like he could be a tiny little figurine, like a little play toy, but because he's not overlapping with any of the features of the Madonna. You can see that her drapery is to the point where it's barely almost touching his finger, but it's not. And the only element that we really see is his connection to the pillar in the back, which is unconventional in and of itself, and the fact that it doesn't have a capital or an order at the top, which is an unconventional approach, which is what's making it a manneristic painting. But if his finger was overlapping or right behind that drapery of Madonna, then we would know that he's in the middle ground. But it almost appears with this manneristic style that there is a backdrop that was formulated with this figure to the bottom right in connection to this unconventional pillar, and then she was just suddenly like a collage glued on top of this backdrop. Right? There's like two totally different environments overlapping one another, and that's a very manneristic approach. So it makes you question, what ground are they in? Are they in the foreground, or are they in the middle ground, or are they in the background? So there's almost like two totally different grounds existing all together. You have the figure in what appears to be a middle to a background, and then you have the Madonna with Jesus in the foreground. But there's no connection to foreground, to the middle ground, and background. It's disjointed, it's disconnected, which again is what makes it very manneristic. So that pretty much explains the painting aspect. We're not going to go into all the paintings because there's just so much information that we need to go through. But remember, what I'm telling you is what you're going to be tested on. So figure 22.41. Now let's look at what the sculpture looked like. Figure 22.46. Gian Bolagni. And this is the abduction of the Sabine women. All right. And just remember, the mannerisms that we saw in the painting are also going to reflect in the sculpture. Now, how is that similar? Let's talk about it. So, first of all, he is a Flemish artist, and he moved to Florence. So, with his Flemish background, which was highly involved in symbolism as well as interest in painting and oils in particular, he's going to transfer a lot of those kind of value concepts that were very prominent with the chiaroscuro in particular in Flanders and in the Flemish areas in particular, and start to place that upon the sculptural elements that we see here with the abduction of the Sabine women. So he started in Flanders in Northern Europe, and then he moved to Italy. Okay, so he became part of the Italian manneristic style at the late Renaissance period. All right, and moved from Northern Europe to be part of that. So what this story is actually, it is Greco-Roman. So don't forget that they're still tapping into the Greco-Roman antiquity, the stories involved. And what the story is the Roman abduction of wives for themselves. This is something during the Roman Empire that they would do. They would go and abduct the wives of the ones that were conquered and make them their own. So this is part of the historical nature of the Roman Empire. Okay, what happened in their history? Good or bad, they're portraying what was historically happening, which is what makes it Greco-Roman, which makes it Renaissance, which makes it a manneristic Renaissance, okay, to show a distortion of history, to show the truth through something that was distorted, through something that was not really discussed. So the Mannerists would take, again, they don't want to contrive the art, they want to place the art in our view to see what emotions will unfold. And in this case, it's a historical story of the emotions that unfold through the abduction of wives, versus the painting, it was more about the elongations of the features and such, not trying to follow mathematical formulas. Here, it's more about this happened, and it's not something that's being omitted. We're going to review it and we're going to discuss it. Yeah, so that's kind of the Greco-Roman aspect. And another thing is it's a spiral composition of nudes. So you have 3 nudes, right? But they're creating a spiral from the bottom base plinth, in which they're all chiseled from, up to the tip of her finger. It's creating this constant spiral. And it's running a vertical axis through the middle. And again, that comes from antiquity. That's something that the sculpture I want you to look at is on your own, as part of your homework, is Laocoon. Right? And Titian, that we just talked about, also referred to this painting, or through this sculpture. And this sculpture was made during the Hellenistic period. And you'll see it's the snake that's wound around specific figures. And refer to that sculpture for this just as you referred to it with Titian, with a Bacchus painting. All right? And again, it's spelled Laocoon. Look at that sculpture during the Greek Hellenistic period, and you'll see the relationship. So they're tapping, Guillaume is tapping into that classical Greek sculpture, right? And playing with the same vertical axis spiral that is within that sculpture. And the reason why I mentioned this sculpture a couple times with Titian and now with Guillaume is because it was just found during this time. In the late 16th century, that sculpture was discovered, and it was discovered and it was studied, and it was studied by these artists. So these Manneristic painters, Titian is considered a Manneristic painter as well, some of it, and then Guillaume here, the sculptor, are both Mannerist, and they studied the mannerisms of the Hellenistic Greek art. And that sculpture in particular, Laocoon, is a component in reference to what's going on here in Mannerism, because it was just discovered. It'd be like if today we discovered a whole bunch of abstract paintings of Salvador Dali that were hidden away we didn't know about. Painters will want to flood in and see them and draw them in the museums and try to adapt them to their own abstract works. All right, the same concepts, and there can be a whole new move of surrealism based off of what was hidden for a period of time. It's the same kind of concept. Yeah, so it has the spiral composition. Know that is tapping into that vertical axis of interest of sculpting all the way back in the Greek. Now I know this class does not cover the Greek art, but I'm letting you know that this is a technique that was used in antiquity that's being brought back during this Manneristic style as well. One thing that is happening that has not really been typical in sculpting, which is what makes this this exaggerated mannerism, is the reintroduction of sculpture 360 degrees. A lot of the sculpture that we've looked at, it's sculpture that's meant to be viewed like a hemisphere. Okay, only like half of it is supposed to be viewed. All right, it's not supposed to be viewed at 360 degrees. In this case, with the abduction of the Saban women, it's meant to be viewed all the way around. And the values of light and shadow and highlights and dark shadows shift as you move around. And it shifts based off of a sculptural principle of design called closed and open form. Closed and open form. Where the figure is closed, it's holding itself tightly, and it creates dark shadows, okay? Almost like where the left arm of the center figure is holding upon the lower regions of the female figure on the top, and his right arm is closed down onto her left leg. That's a closed section. Versus the arms that are up, like the lower figure with his left arm, and then her arm with her left arm at the very top, that's open form. Closed form is where it tights, creates really dark shadows. Open form, it's light, and it creates highlights. And that can only really be obtained whenever you have a sculpture that's in 360 degrees. Okay? So it's a very manneristic approach as well. So I'll leave with that in the fact that this sculpture in particular is the first that we're seeing in that 360 degree vertical spinning spiraled axis moving upward. Something that hasn't been seen since antiquity, and in particular that one sculpture that was just discovered, Laocoon. Okay, so again, Laocoon. So because of that finding, this sculpture made its way into the late Renaissance in the Manneristic style. Okay? I'll leave you with that, with chapter 22, and we'll march into chapter 22 here real soon, or 23 real soon.